user of the NHS. There's the manufacturer, there's the supplier to the NHS, there's then the contract awarder, private company, all taking their cuts. There are monopoly, oligopoly contracts being awarded as part of the system, so that competition actually is not a live regulator of prices or supply. And the centralized system prohibits local purchase of items and was intended to do so. So that's a big reason why the NHS was seen as failing to respond to all those local officers. That was because literally local NHS managers were told you can't, these are centralized procurement decisions. Beyond this, and this is not even in our report actually, there's an even more institutionalized system of an oligopoly, a privileged oligopoly of strategic suppliers. There's 35 companies designated by the government since about 2013 as strategic suppliers. They include, shockingly, unsurprisingly, Serco, Deloitte, etc. These companies between them win 22% of all government contracts by value. They include the big outsourcers, Serco, G4S, they include the big consultants, and each supplier, we assign a Crown representative. That sounds like an ambassador. It is. It's a senior civil servant we pay to be our representative to visit Serco, Deloitte, etc., and keep them happy. And they're strategic because we don't want them to fail. Again, this is a perversion of a core principle of public service systems. If you need capacity so badly, this is the capacity you need to have in-house, direct, yourself. This is not capacity that you outsource because it becomes subject to political negotiations and perversions. So, in terms of the of addressing the problem, we need to recognize two things. Firstly, the seriousness of the problems of NHS dependency on outsourced systems of supplies and services, the risk and inappropriateness of just-in-time production systems from public health service. It's no good having a just-in-time production system, PPE, being made in China in response to demand here. That lead time is far too great. Global supply chains have been shown to be badly wanting way beyond health services actually under COVID. And that's one simple lesson. Secondly, the inefficiency and expense of middlemen in those supply chains. Thirdly, the inflexibility of vested interest. One reason why local NHS managers were told they couldn't respond to local offers was that there were companies with monopoly or oligopoly supply contracts with the DHSC who said, no, you can't let other people sell. We have this contract that says we have not oligopoly or a monopoly. Secondly, the positive aspect of building public sector capacity is that you need public sector capacity to deliver a service, and it's not a question of a series of pop-up private projects being able to substitute for that. And so you have direct employment of staff in a whole range of functions to respond and optimize the public service objectives, the efficiency and cheapness of not having to pay for the capital returns, democratic control of accountability and maximum transparency, and democratic responsiveness to public needs, and the capacity to monitor any suppliers that you do give contracts to. So in moving towards this system of efficient democratic control, I've set out there 4 points, and these are elaborated, some of these are elaborated in the report. The firstly, to start with a fundamental direct or outsourced review of all outsourced work from the NHS. This has got so extensive a system, it needs to be done from scratch, but that's perfectly feasible. And the objectives with that, one core objective with that should be to look at all these strategic suppliers and say, if this is strategic capacity that we need to have, then we should have it within the public sector. Secondly, as part of that process, the outcome of that process should surely be, because there are powerful reasons for it that we've seen, that the NHS should be re-insourcing distribution, stockpiling, test, track and trace, cleaning and catering, which were first outsourced under the Thatcher governments. Thirdly, that the NHS should ensure there is local capacity to produce whatever equipment it needs. Now, that doesn't have to be directly, it can be by SMEs, it can be by local universities, all of which showed themselves really ready to adapt and respond. But the NHS should plan on that basis, that in each region there should be this capacity available. And so that capacity can be from the private sector, it can be from voluntary sector, it can be from universities, but it should also be possible to do it from NHS or public sector manufacturing capacity. And I'll come back to that point because that may be a bit of a surprise to some of you. Finally, the privatised procurement system should be simply ended and reinstate a simple non-corrupt public process of procurement as per the 1990s. And that's a simple step, but a fundamental step. What are the potential problems with this that people might see? Firstly, do we lose private sector efficiency? No. We've seen from our own experience in the UK, the private sector is not systematically more efficient or even particularly efficient at all. And global empirical evidence, huge amounts of it, which I've spent a distressingly large chunk of my life reading, shows there is no systemic advantage of the private sector, even in terms of efficiency at the firm level. However, we should pay attention to what the private sector actually does, because again, contrary to widespread assumptions, the private sector is frequently prepared to end outsourcing and bring work back in-house. And that's because in manufacturing production, as well as in public services, empirical studies actually find that there is a negative relationship between outsourcing of activities and long-term loss of firm productivity growth. The big positive example here is one of our few great small private engineering successes, JCB. In 2004, they said, we're not going to keep on buying our engines for our machinery, we're going to start making them ourselves. A few years later, they'd started making machines that they then realized could power something fast enough to win the world land speed record. That's insourcing. That's the power of insourcing. We can do it. JCB can do it. We can do it. And the question of manufacturing. Bit of a bold step there, perhaps, that even Nye Bevan said the NHS wouldn't make its own paper clips. But actually, we've already got some public sector manufacturing capacity set up for health service supplies. Even more remarkably, it's been set up by this government and the predecessor. It's been set up to manufacture vaccines, which is far-sighted. And for exactly the reasons we're experiencing the need for vaccine manufacture. Theresa May's government set up a new vaccine manufacturer in 2018, and Boris has since expanded that, accelerated that, and bought another facility. And really, the government should be applauded for doing that and continuing to do that. It's one of the few things they've got absolutely right. But it also demonstrates how public sector manufacturing capacity can be can be a solution to delivering major solutions. Finally, this note, all the problems that I've been talking about and the NAO have been talking about so far were with the system in England, and that's the system we analysed in the report. It's different and less awful in Scotland. Which is another illustration that it doesn't have to happen this way. We don't have to have a privatised system of procurement. It doesn't. There are places, parts of the UK where that doesn't happen. The same is true with test, track and trace, and also with hospital cleaning. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, hospital cleaning has all been insourced. So we can do all this. We are doing all this elsewhere in the UK. And finally, that's a slightly techie slide, but it does show that the UK proportionately spends more on outsourcing contracts for goods and services relative to direct employment of public employees than almost any other EU country. We need to address that balance. Okay, I'm sorry if I overran by a minute or two, but I hope that was useful. Thanks.
That's absolutely brilliant, Dave. Thank you so much. That was a really thorough analysis of the problem and a really exciting vision of a better way of doing things. We're now going to move on to Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Chancellor and the Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office. She's been the MP for Leeds West since 2010. And as I'm sure you'll all be aware, she's a leading voice within Labour on why outsourcing the coronavirus crisis has been so harmful for our communities. So Rachel, over to you.
Thank you very much. And that was just such an incredibly powerful presentation from David and reports as well, which I've enjoyed reading. I think some people have suggested that it's shared with people, the slides are shared with people on the call today, and I think that would be really helpful, because the more we can get this message out, I think the better. For me, I think similar to David in lots of ways, the reasons why I think that this model of outsourcing and crony capitalism is so awful is really for three key reasons. The first and probably the most important one is it's just not working. The services that are being delivered are inferior to those that are delivered by the public sector. Second, it's not accountable, and so when things go wrong, there's almost nothing you can do about it. And third, it's bad value for money. And I'll just say a little bit about all of those points. I just give some sort of key statistics as well to start with. 12 billion pounds has been spent on outsourcing test and trace, and the SAGE report on it has said it's just made a marginal impact on controlling the virus. I mean, that is just really appalling to think that 12 billion pounds has been spent on something and the difference made is just marginal. Think what that 12 billion pounds could have been spent on to make a substantial difference to controlling the virus. 40% of close contacts reported by people who test positive for the virus are not followed up with by Serco, Citl and the 28 companies who they subcontract the work of contact tracing to. And we know that 80% of those contacts have to be reached and then isolate to make the substantive difference that we need. And we see today when the government announced that at the end of a 4-week lockdown, that everywhere is going back into the same tier they were in before, if not a higher tier, that this whole thing is just not working properly. And instead of using the last 4 weeks to rethink how we do things like test and trace, we're just going back to where we were before. The National Audit Office, as David has said that £10 billion more has been spent than needed to on PPE because the government ran down the stockpile in its bid to save money as their austerity drive. And as a result, as usual, it ends up costing more because usually a little bit investment saves money in the long run, but that's not a lesson or a mantra that this government accepts or wants to learn. Beyond the issue of the NHS outsourcing, which David speaks so powerfully about in his report and his presentation today, that the government have been spending £7,000 a day on some consultants are being paid £7,000 a day for work that they're doing in the public sector. That is totally unacceptable. They're earning hundreds of thousands of pounds potentially a year for doing work in the public sector. And I think David says in his report something like, working for the NHS, working for the public sector is a responsibility, not an opportunity to earn huge profits and take home huge wages. £1.5 billion and counting has gone in contacts to friends and donors of the Conservative Party. And I see on the chat people are saying they like the My Little Crony hashtag. My daughter, who's 7 years old, has my collection of My Little Ponies from circa 1985, and so now every time she plays with them, I can't help thinking of Serco and Deloitte and PwC rather than Magic Twilight or Rainbow Sunshine or whatever they're supposed to be called. But that's just an aside. It is a great hashtag. So what is the problem? I sort of started to allude to it right at the beginning there. there. I think the first problem is that it's not working. Why isn't it working? It's because these outsourced companies are not integrated into the fabric of our communities in the way that public services are. The NHS, our GP surgeries, our walk-in centres, our hospitals and our local councils are integrated into the fabric of our communities, mine in Leeds and yours wherever you are in the country. That is not the case for Serco and PwC and Deloitte. They are not part of the fabric of our communities, and so they don't join up with the other services at a local level. And certainly in my local authority, when we've done the contact tracing at a local level and linked it up to the community hubs that are supporting people who are vulnerable and having to self-isolate, we have a much higher success rate in tracing and also encouraging people to isolate. And Serco just don't have those reaches into our local communities. So I believe that a model of a centralized model and a privatized model is never going to achieve the same outcomes as a public model and a local model. And I think those two things actually are both really important. You know, privatized and local wouldn't work, but neither would national and public. These things have got to be done at a local level, and they've got to be integrated into the fabric of our communities. Second, on accountability, you know, it really defies belief that there are no penalty clauses in the Serco contract. So if they contact 0% of people or 100% of people, doesn't matter, they still get paid the same. And that's just wrong. You know, if we don't like what our local councils are doing, people don't like what I'm doing, and you live in Leeds West, you can kick me out, and you can kick out your local councillors as well. You can kick out the government. You can't kick out Serco, although you could vote Labour at the next election and promise you we won't be using them to do these contracts. But you know, the point is that they are not accountable to the citizens of our country, and that's wrong in a democracy. And the third issue, and again, David touches on this very powerfully in his report when he talks about the different layers of privatisation that's going on, and therefore the different profit margins that need to be earned at each level. You know, the profit motive is what guides private companies. It's in their DNA, and in fact it's in their constitutions, and it's in the Companies Act. Their objective is to serve their shareholders, not to serve the public. And as a result, we're overpaying for this, because I mean, you might have seen a few weeks ago that Rupert Soames, the chief executive of Serco, said that for the first time for several years, Serco is looking to pay a dividend this year. They're paying a dividend based on the profits made by a contract to support people during the virus. They have not delivered properly on that contract because of the low contact tracing rate, but they are delivering for their shareholders with these with the dividends that they're looking to pay out. David also says, and this is right, that privatisation has left us unprepared. I think also that the makeup of our economy has left us unprepared. And this is a wider point probably than the one we're discussing today, but I think it also merits some attention and some thought, because as we have run down the manufacturing sector and the textiles industry and the manufacturing base in our country, you know, we've become, you know, the 6th richest country in the world, can't even produce the PPE to protect our frontline workers, despite the fact that, you know, particularly in my part of the world, in Yorkshire and in Lancashire as well, you know, we were once the textile centre of the world, and now, you know, we're, you know, on our knees with a begging bowl asking other countries to protect our frontline workers. And so I think we do need to rethink the makeup of our economy so that we are more resilient and more secure as a country and able to produce these basic goods and services. I just sort of finish off by saying something about, you know, why this makes me so angry and my history in this area. In the last Parliament, I chaired the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee. It's a long title and it had a wide remit. But the thing I was most proud of doing was chairing the inquiry into the collapse of Carillion. And what we saw with Carillion was a business built on, it was a house of cards. It had such flimsy foundations that it was always, the question wasn't whether it was going to fail, it was when it was going to fail. But they sort of hoodwinked government. They bought up all of the competition so that there was no competition. The point that David made about a monopoly or an oligopoly, there were government contracts that they put out to tender, and there was only one company that bid for them because the company had bought up all the competition. And so the idea that you get some vibrant private sector to innovate and drive down costs is just a load of baloney, because you only had one company bidding for these contracts. But also what you had again was companies that were paying out dividends, even to the bitter end. Carillion were paying dividends out to their shareholders and bonuses to their the bosses at the top of the company, at the same time that they had a huge pension deficit. And year after year, they had letters from the pensions regulator saying you've got to do something about it, but nothing ever happened. Although they were signatories to the government's prompt payment code, when they went bankrupt, there were subcontractors who hadn't been paid for, in some cases, 6 months by the company. That wouldn't happen in the public sector. So they took with them many small companies who were reliant on work, again, partly because they had a monopoly in the industry. And so you couldn't afford not to work for Carillion if you're a subcontractor, because you wouldn't get any construction work in big public contracts. And so it was really through that work that I did on Carillion that when I took up this role in the Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and Minister for the Cabinet Office, and that brief covers government procurement and outsourcing, that I really wanted to shine a spotlight really on what I see as a mixture of a lack of value for money, a lack of accountability, and a cronyism at the heart of the government outsourcing model. And something that I knew about, and probably all of us on this call knew about and have known about for a number of years, I think is now being thrown into sharp relief really by what we've seen in the last few months through the government's response to this crisis. At every opportunity, the government have shown its addiction to outsourcing by every opportunity going to the private sector rather than to our trusted and integrated public service providers in our councils and in our NHS. And I think it is wrong. I think it exposes the Tories' obsession with the private sector and its disregard and disrespect for public sector and public services. And in the end, it's fleecing taxpayers for billions of pounds that could be spent on our public services, our public sector workers, who of course have been told now that they're going to have a pause in their pay increases, or a freeze as others might call it. And even those who are the lowest paid, who Rishi Sunak claimed yesterday would be protected, will not see their pay go up in line with the cost of living. And these are some of the lowest paid workers in our economy and in our society. So this is something I care passionately about. It's something that the Labour Party are doing more and more on. I think Keir Starmer's raised it now for the last 3 weeks at Prime Minister's Questions to get this issue more exposure, the exposure that it needs and deserves. And I think it's something that is really cutting through with the public, and the work that We Own It and the Good Law Project and campaigners like all of you are doing is absolutely essential to that. And the more people who know about this, the more anger I think develops, and the more pressure we can put on the government and politicians to stop this model, and instead to invest in our public services and our local communities and our public servants as well. Thank you very much for inviting me this evening.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and it's brilliant to have your really strong voice making the case that outsourcing isn't working and privatisation in this way isn't working. It's so fantastic that you're making all of these points, and I think it's such a good point that these outsourcing companies are not integrated into our communities. They're not accountable to us, they're accountable to the shareholders, and it's fantastic to see you making that point again and again. So we're now going to hear from Caroline Malloy, who is the editor of openDemocracy UK and our NHS. She's a journalist and a speaker who's written extensively on politics, public services and the welfare state. Caroline's done amazing work investigating the contracts given out during this pandemic, and she's also really hot stuff on the future of the NHS and what's happening in terms of NHS reforms, which is a threat just coming round the corner. So I'm really happy to pass over now to Caroline Malloy.
Thank you, Kat, and that's very kind of you. I will try and live up to that. And it's really good to hear the previous speakers' anger. I think I've also been looking at this issue of NHS privatisation for a number of years, and always, but particularly at the moment, it's really notable that when I call up the likes of Serco or Deloitte, as I do, whilst in their reports to their shareholders and on their websites, they are full of how they are playing this pivotal role in saving us from the pandemic. when I talk to them, the main thing they're keen to say is, oh no, we're not doing that bit. We're not doing that bit. We're not doing that bit that's messing up. No, someone else, some other private company is doing that, you know, and that's part of the problem, the fragmentation that Dave talked about. There's so many fingers to point. Rachel's quite right. They're not evil. They've just, you know, have a legal duty to pay attention to their bottom line rather than public service and being integrated in the local community. And it's quite hard to unpick when they say we're not doing that, we're not doing that, because they're not publishing the contracts sometimes at all. Sometimes not till after they've been awarded. Most of these are not with competition, and then often with the key actual service delivery bits redacted. So you only have the vaguest idea of what they're even supposed to be doing. And the government press office, when I speak to them, sometimes actually gives me completely wrong information because there's so many contracts. They are confused about how many contracts are floating around, I think. You know, the Serco contract is particularly, you know, we have seen actually more of it. I'm not surprised they don't want to talk about it, because it talks about how the government is contracting with them in good faith. A senior former civil servant said to me, you never put vague nonsense like that in a contract. And the idea that Serco, with their history, would provide services in good faith is frankly ridiculous. So, you know, I think one of the things with PPE is, and this PPE supply chain, is that it's been the victim, unfortunately now, very unfortunately now, of a sort of strategy with privatisation in the NHS as a whole, where we'll all fight that kicking and screaming. So they've started with the unsexy stuff, right? So the back office stuff. So things, absolutely things like the supply chain, procurement, PPE supplies, also things incidentally like testing and laboratories and the tests that you get from the doctors and the people who, you know, all of that has been so fragmented and messed around with. An interesting name in all of this that hasn't been mentioned so far is Lord Carter, regrettably, I think a Labour peer, who in 2015, Lord Carter incidentally made his money from providing social care homes. Anyway, he's been brought in to do a number of reviews, including of restructuring all of our pathology, including of restructuring the entire PPE supply chain. In 2015, he put out a report, and there was about, you know, how the NHS could save £5 billion a year by being more efficient in how it procured staff, and I think also not letting staff have so many holidays or something. And, you know, there was very credulous reporting in the media of how this was going to save the NHS loads of money, and you saw lots of stories, you've probably all seen them in the past, about how the NHS spends silly amounts on pack of paracetamol and stuff. Of course, there are examples like this, but what was sort of glossed over in the media, and what was, if you actually look at the analysis, the NHS, traditionally with its huge economies of scale, was pretty good at procurement, you know, and the fragmentation of it is what has led to it being ripped off as well, so badly as we see now, as well as, you know, what Dave sets out so well about how it's actually private companies procuring other private companies now, you know, what I call the privatisation of the privatisation itself behind the scenes. And we have companies like Deloitte, who I've written about on openDemocracy, you know, very much all over this, alongside McKinsey and all the rest. There is a terrible revolving door between government and these consultancies, both at ministerial level with the likes of Chloe Smith in the Cabinet Office, who's come from Deloitte, but also at officer level. I mean, for example, Deloitte were actually brought, Lord Carter said, let's save loads of money on procuring PPE and stuff like that. We can do it much cheaper. It was impossible targets that he set. No one met them. So a couple of years later, the government said, oh dear, we haven't met those targets, those impossible targets. So let's bring in Deloitte. And the person who made the decision to bring in Deloitte had been working for Deloitte until, or one of the 4 people on the panel, I should say, had been working for Deloitte as recently as the previous year. So, you know, this I think what I really wanted to get across, because I don't want to take up too much time, it'd be nice to have a few questions, is that, you know, as Dave, I think, set out really clearly, it's not just the recent emergency, most egregious examples of cronyism. Okay, it was all done in a rush. We all kind of understand that. done pretty sloppily. Tory mates have been cashed in left, right and centre, and but even without that, as Dave said, I do question whether the whole system of procurement, both on goods and on services, and of course there is a distinction, they are procured differently, there is a distinction in the regime. But I have read a number of Public Accounts Committee and NAO reports over the years about various NHS privatisations, mostly on the services side, I should say. And they all, so the actual provision of clinical services like ambulances or, treatment centres and God knows what. And they always end up saying the same thing for years, which is, this was procured badly, we need to procure better. And somehow the finger always ends up getting pointed at the civil servants. And I'm like, well, maybe the entire model is flawed, really. If you don't have this sort of public service, grounded in local communities ethos. I think it's interesting that there's been so much focus on PPE, incidentally. I mean, the government, in its response to the National Audit Office report, really focused almost entirely on PPE, although many questions, I've been writing particularly about the contact tracing, many other questions about all aspects of the COVID response. The government likes to focus on PPE. A professor of procurement told me that because it can sort of play the card of like, well, we're protecting the staff and we had to do that really urgently, so we're sorry if we break a few eggs along the way. So I think that's something to really watch out for, that the government just wants to talk about PPE and the lines get a bit muddled. I think some of the examples there though have been shocking. I mean, there was a story recently about a middleman. There's been all these stories about middlemen, and somehow we only hear the details when like the ship goes missing and we never get those gloves, and we hear about the horrendous markups that are being charged, although that is beginning to come out a little bit more now. But I think we're making a mess of procuring goods, we're making a mess of procuring services, and I think we need to think about whether competition, is the problem a lack of competition and it's just going to Tory cronies? I don't think so. I think the problem is that this competition model isn't the best way to deliver a public service. I'll just wrap up by saying, Dave said that Nye Bevan said that the NHS shouldn't make its own paperclips, and indeed that was correct. Although he did talk about the NHS making some of its own pharmaceutical supplies, and I agree with a lot of Dave's points about, we could look at NHS's goods, the goods it consumes differently. I think part of the problem is that those who have sought to defend NHS privatisation of services have sometimes kind of used the fact that, well, you lot are just crazy anti-privatisation communists who want the NHS to do everything, even make their own paperclips. And, I think we need to kind of push really hard back and say, well, actually, there was a doctrine from a former Prime Minister, shall I say, who said what matters is what works. And it's very clear that this system is not working. And not only do we need to push back against the privatisation of NHS services underneath the NHS logo, which many people are not fully aware of yet, but also have a long look at goods. And I will just flag up that it's really good that we're having this conversation and people are getting more aware of this now, because there is more to come on the privatisation of NHS services. Downing Street has got a secretive task force. I wrote an article about it. It was raised in Parliament 2 days ago, and Matt Hancock looked very uncomfortable at what Johnson is plotting without really telling anyone, with people from, ex-McKinsey and all these kind of consultants and ideologues, basically, with more to come if we don't stop them. So I will leave it there.
Thank you. Fantastic, Caroline. And we'll obviously be keeping a close eye on Open Democracy, because they keep a close eye on these developments and what's going on with that NHS reform plan. So do check them out if you haven't already. So we're now going to move on to Q&A. I'm going to hand over to Chris for questions. I know that lots of you have asked questions and made comments. We'll pick some of the top ones, and then we'll go into a quick plan for action before wrapping up by 6:30.
Brilliant, thank you, Kat. And just to echo what Kat said there, it's there's over 300 people on this call, and I've definitely seen more than 300 questions. So I'm going to try and squeeze in as many as possible. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and put a couple of questions to each of our panelists and get you to respond to those questions, rather than getting you all to come in and respond to all of them, if that's okay. So I'm going to start off with with Rachel with a couple of questions that have come in on this stuff. So the first one I wanted to put to you was, someone's asking why it was legal to give contracts to the friends and allies of essentially the Tory party and the government. Is that specifically because of the emergency legislation around COVID that's allowed that? Or is it, I guess, more of a tip of the, as kind of Caroline was alluding to, more of the tip of the iceberg with regard to the procurement issue? And the wider problem is the wider outsourcing agenda rather than just the kind of cronyism that we've seen.
It's a really good question. The emergency legislation was passed for good reason, that things had to happen really quickly. But I do think that the government has taken advantage of that legislation to go above and beyond in terms of outsourcing. That legislation didn't require, for example, everything to be outsourced and not to be given to the NHS and to local councils. Local councils have been crying out to get the work to do testing and tracing at a local level because they know they'll do it better. And the Good Law Project are obviously taking the government to court around some of the contracts that they've handed out. So that will be tested in the courts about the way in which some of these contracts were rewarded to people like Allende, who made the face masks that were unusable. The taxpayer still paid for them, but they've not been able to be used. Owen Paterson, who's a former cabinet minister, is paid £100,000 a year by Allende as a consultant. Many other stories about people with very close links with the Conservative Party, friends or donors, or current MPs pay on the payroll of these companies and getting these contracts. And that's what the court case by the Good Law Project will explore, whether these things are legal. If they are legal, they shouldn't be. If they're not legal, then the government should be prosecuted for these decisions.
Brilliant, thank you, Rachel. The second question I've got for you is quite a straightforward question, but it perhaps doesn't have a straightforward answer. There's a similar question coming from a number of people, which is just, would it be possible to legislate and to make it a law that people aren't able to profit from delivering public services?
I guess so. I mean, that would, I guess, though, mean no private sector involvement in the public sector. And as Caroline said, you know, the NHS aren't going to be, I mean, you know, you're not going to have public sector builders necessarily building new hospitals, for example. But I think there is some merit to what you're saying there. I'm sort of quite struck by some work of the Foundational Economy Collective, who talk about social licensing for people who are involved in delivering public services, that there are higher standards required of them than firms normally would be required. So those would be things like profits, like environmental concerns, like paying a real living wage, like paying all your subcontractors on time. And you could ensure that all contracts only went to people who fulfill these obligations, and you could have much tougher clauses in public sector contracts. Some local authorities are starting to do these sorts of things, and the Welsh Government are as well. So I think there are ways that you could do this, that where things are outsourced because there is an argument for it, or you know, the government find that there's no capacity in the public sector, there's no skills in the public sector, you have got to outsource something. You could do it in a much different way to what's happening now, and you know, and not having these profits on the back of public services. But fundamentally, I would like to see much more of these services run in-house. I would like to see the insourcing of contracts rather than the continual outsourcing at both a local and a national level, because as I said at the beginning, I think then you get the accountability, the value for money, and also the integration with the other local public services. You know, when you outsource something, it's not in a vacuum. You know, it has to be integrated with the other local services. And I just don't think you get that with companies like PwC and Serco, which I guess is my main argument.
Thanks, Rachel. That's really helpful, and it really segues onto to the questions that I wanted to put to David now. The first of which is on that point around value for money. So We've had a question from Caroline, which has come in, which has said, has a comparison study been made at all between the cost and efficiency between the devolved nations with a view to showing the excess cost levied in England as a result of privatisation? David, you're the person that I suspect will know the answer to this one, so I'm going to let you come in there. You'll need to unmute, Dave.
It's an easy, quick answer. The answer is either no, or at least I've not seen anything that does that systematically. I've been looking for something like that, but not found it yet. Maybe if somebody else knows of it, perhaps they could mention it. But that would obviously be a very important piece of work and might look very interesting indeed, especially, for example, in relation to test, track and trace. But I suspect we're not going to see systematic or be able to see systematic comparisons of that for a few months yet.
Great, thanks, Dave. The second question I wanted to put to you was, in your presentation, one of the things you mentioned was the issue of, the state funding the manufacturing of vaccine, but outsourcing the various other bits of the response, including the test, track and trace system. So why do you think it is that the government decided to in-house the vaccine manufacturing, but outsource test, track and trace and PPE procurement and other aspects of the response?
Yeah, very interesting question. It's because there's been in parallel big discussions going on in the health arena, both in this country and internationally, about how to address some very big issues in terms of public health and healthcare generally. One of which has been how to prepare for potential further epidemics, and all that work has been carried out in the wake of the earlier epidemics earlier this century, the SARS epidemics, etc. And various plans were devised to deal with that. And the warehousing system, the PIPP system for PPE and other equipment was part of that process that the UK decided to implement. And of course, there was an exercise, Operation Cobra, I think it was called, that was carried out that concluded there needed to be more money spent on that kind of preparation, which Jeremy Hunt said, no, that was cost too much money and it was a victim of austerity. So those processes have been going on in the UK and in other countries. And other countries, clearly, from what we can see around the world, have taken those the lessons of those exercises more seriously. In terms of the vaccine manufacturing, that strategy is, I think, those decisions, I think, can be understood as stemming from those concerns, and that there was enough impetus behind them in a slightly parallel structure. Technically, VMIC is owned by 3 universities, University of Oxford, Imperial College and London School of Tropical Hygiene and Medicine. And I think that possibly makes it easier to develop a public sector entity under that kind of ownership and management. But also there's a big parallel discussion been going on for years and still going on about the failure of the private pharmaceutical firms to develop much needed medicines to, for example, new antibiotics. And again, there was Theresa May commissioned someone to provide a special report, a banker, of course, a merchant banker, who provided a report on this and said, well, he was inclined to agree with people at the WHO who said that the only way this could be done would be to have publicly owned drug companies developing new antibiotics from the start and distributing them and allocating them. So there've been some big sort of impetuses behind this kind of discussion that I think when all this unravels, COVID will be found to have reinforced these discussions and these developments. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that was incredibly clear, David. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to move on to Caroline now for our final 2 questions, and they're linked, so I'm going to put them to you in one go, if that's okay. And hopefully, for people who've been following Open Democracy's work over the last few days, it'll be probably quite clear as to why I'm asking these. So the first one's coming from Janie. Janie's asked, So these contracts that have been given out to various private companies throughout the pandemic are funded by taxes and done through government departments. They're publicly tendered contracts, or not necessarily tendered in some instances. But are those contracts, or should those contracts be available via FOI requests, Freedom of Information requests? And the kind of second follow-up question to that is, I know that you've been doing some work looking at the various contracts, is in terms of in those instances where the companies have patently failed to deliver, and there's a huge number of examples of that we've seen throughout this crisis, are there any ways that we could be clawing back the money or demanding that the money should be paid back from the companies which have failed to deliver on contracts as part of that? Okay,
so in terms of should contracts be available by Freedom of Information requests, yes, but we shouldn't actually need to do Freedom of Information requests. They are supposed to publish them within 90 days, I believe. They are not doing that. They are abusing all sorts of transparent. David Cameron talked about open government a few years ago, and they made all kinds of promises. But this is also required in European law, which is an interesting point because, frankly, we do not know what's going to happen after the 1st of January. Anyway, I won't get into Brexit. And also openDemocracy has been submitting Freedom of Information requests and discovering that we are on all sorts of blacklists, and the government is having all sorts of coordination to try and avoid answering our questions, but we are doing that nonetheless. Can we claw back the money if they fail to deliver? Very difficult. I mean, I think there are individual court cases and individual sort of cases where that happens. I'm not a particular expert. I would say more broadly, with private companies and private company law in general, if a company goes bust owing all sorts of money to its workers and suppliers and whoever, it seems to be able to get away with that and then rise from the flames in some new incarnation. So, there are so many ways that private companies can evade really paying the cost. I mean, Serco narrowly avoided being one of the first companies being prosecuted for fraud when it and essentially the Serious Fraud Office made a deal with it where it paid some money and avoided prosecution. I'm not saying the Serious Fraud Office did anything wrong, but it was the first time in history that a government contractor had been given that kind of deal. And they actually said, well, if it had been done for fraud, then they would have probably been barred from doing contracts in the meantime. And I think part of the problem is that we have this culture of, this 30-year ideology, or if not longer, of all you need is an MBA and an outsourcing company to run any kind of public service. And clearly we are reaping the consequences of that. I just wanted to say one thing, which I saw a really lovely question in the comments, which is it legal for them to use the NHS logo? And I was going to say, sadly, yes. And that is a bit of a shift in recent years. And I would love to see a campaign where they are not allowed to do this and not allowed to hide behind the NHS logo when it suits them, and the NHS gets the blame for services that are being delivered by these private companies.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you to all of our panelists. I've learned a huge amount in the last hour, and it's been an absolute honour to have you on this call, as well as the nearly 300 people who stayed for the full hour. Thank you so much. There have been loads of questions which have come in, which have been asking, well, what do we do about all this? And I'm going to pass over to Kat now, who hopefully will answer that question with something small that we can do off the back of this call to really push the campaign against the outsourcing of the pandemic response that we've seen and we've been talking about this evening. So over to Kat.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks again to the speakers and to all of you. It's been such a good discussion. So I'm going to share with you now 3 links. These are the links to the report. So you can download it, you can read it, you can share it. A link to a blog that we just put up on the website this afternoon with a sign that you can download which says no more contracts to MPs mates. So if you feel strongly about that, you can share that on social media, or you can send a picture of yourself doing that to your MP. And also a link to the donate button on our website. which it would be wonderful if any of you are up for donating. I think something that came out really strongly during the chat was people were saying, can we save these slides that David's produced? Can we save this chat? Can we save all this information? So what we'll do is we'll put on the blog that I've shared, the No More Contracts to MPs blogs, we'll upload, if we can, I'm looking to Chris for a nod here, the slides that David had which explain the report. And then if you have a group, whether that's a trade union, a community group, a local party, a campaign group, where you want to spread the word about this report, that would be really, really amazing. So if you're not particularly in a group, send the report to your MP, let them know, ask questions. And if you are in a group, help us spread the word about this report, because this story of what's happened within our NHS's supply chain is not a story that has been told properly yet to the world. So we are trying to highlight it to the National Audit Office ourselves. But if you can highlight it to your MP and to people that you know who are in this area, it can become knowledge that people are aware of, and that is a good starting point. Thank you again. The speeches were absolutely incredible and really, really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you to the, as Chris said, nearly 300 people stayed on the chat, stayed on the call the whole time. Thank you for caring about our NHS. And I look forward to seeing you on another call and to take more action very, very soon. Thanks everyone, and solidarity.